So speaking of TV, which we were when we last were talking about this last week in part 1, I love the People's Court. Absolutely love it. There's something about the justice of like a really dumb thing that somebody's like, your cousin did this thing. And then, you're suing somebody and they're like, my cousin did no such thing. And then there's a judge that's like, I'm going to hand down justice in 11 minutes. There's something just glorious about that for some reason to me. I don't know. And I doubt it's legally binding, but I always just assume it is. Especially with the People's Court, they're like, you have to fill out paperwork. And it's that filling out paperwork that makes me think it's got to be legally binding, right? Because what else is the paperwork? It's not like a coloring page. So it's got to be something. And the People's Court is great. It's perfect because Marilyn Milian is the judge, and she's like the Goldilocks judge, right? So like Judge Judy, she's a little too gruff for me. I like it when she yells at people sometimes, but like she's sort of indiscriminate in who she yells at. Like she'll just yell at anybody for any reason because she's just real cranky all the time, and that's just who she is as a person. And so Judge Judy she can be tough. And then there's Judge Mathis. And Judge Mathis, he's never said a crossword to anybody. And that's great. Like, he's laughing, he's having a good time. But at the end of the day, it could just be a little like sometimes people do need to get yelled at. So Marilyn Milian is the perfect mix of like she, sometimes she yells and sometimes she's nice, and it's just great. But I think for our purposes this morning, Marilyn Milian has introduced something into my vocabulary the last several years that I think is really important for us this morning, where she describes things a certain way. So somebody will come in, they'll be like, hey, my dog was in the yard and it wasn't on a leash and then it ran and then it got like bit. I'm suing you for $9,000 because my dog got bit. Or, hey, I lost my job and then I couldn't pay rent and then I didn't pay rent and then I got evicted, so now I'm suing my landlord. And what she says all the time is she's like, that's a you problem. That's a you problem, meaning you're the one that has this problem. The person you're suing, it's not their problem. They didn't do it. Like, they didn't put the dog, outside without a leash. They didn't not pay rent or, whatever happens. It's always dogs and rents, always. Those are the big things with the People's Court. And, she's like, that's a you problem, meaning that is your issue, that's your situation, that's a problem that you have, and it is your responsibility to incur that cost, not somebody else. Like, you can't sue somebody else for a you problem because it's a you problem, not a them problem. And I like that phrase, that's a you problem. I really enjoy that phrase in life. And I enjoy that phrase because, especially from like a theological, from a Christian perspective, even just from like being an adult human, it's really important to be able to identify which problems are you problems and which problems are not you problems. Like, which things are a thing that you do that is your responsibility, and which things are problems that are not your responsibility because you didn't do it. Man, being able to tell the difference there is incredibly important for life in general, and specifically this sermon. So last week we started the sermon. This is actually the first time I've done this in 15 years of preaching here, where we have a 2-part sermon, where we started last week and we just had too much, so then we had to pause and say to be continued and come here. Last week, if you were not here, if you did not listen online, this is what we talked about, okay? So we've been in this series called Divine Portraits by Divine Portraits by Jesus. And we've been talking about the fact that Jesus shows us God, okay? Wherever we see Jesus, we see God. Wherever we don't see Jesus, we do not see God. Jesus shows us the exact representation of God. Jesus is the truth about God. Jesus is the visible image of the invisible God. There's lots of biblical ways of putting it. But at the end of the day, when we look at Jesus, no one has ever seen God. But when we see Jesus, we see God. So when we see Jesus doing stuff, or when we see Jesus being something, we are learning something about God. And last week we started talking about how the thing that was maybe the most famous thing Jesus did was heal people. I mean, Jesus is always going around healing people, the sick and the lame and, diseased people, and bringing people back from the dead, and, casting out demons. And like, it's just a thing that Jesus does over and over and over again. And in fact, to the point that if you were alive in the days of Jesus, if you knew things then, if you knew him then, you would have thought of him not so much as a teacher and not so much as a rabbi, but you would have known him as a guy who heals people. So last week, we talked about what that really doesn't mean. A lot of folks say it does, but we talked about the fact that it doesn't mean that, like, you should expect that you're going to be healed, right? That, yes, okay, God heals, and God is a healer, but the reality of the situation is that people get sick and people die. And that's just the way that life is. And we also discussed how even when Jesus does do miracles, they are largely temporary. That, like, when Jesus heals somebody, that somebody ends up dying later on. Or when Jesus brings somebody back from the dead, it's not like they stay alive forever, right? Like, everything that Jesus does from a miraculous healing standpoint is temporary. And it's just, we live in a world where physical healings don't often happen for, chronic illnesses and diseases and things like that. Instead, we live in a world where bodies break down, where we get sick, where people die, and that's just kind of the way it is. The good news that we talked about last week is that in the midst of all of this, because we are temporary people, because we are, somewhat broken people, because we live in very, these earthen vessels the Bible talks about, that are, they fall apart and they degrade and everything else. Because of that, we're sort of backed into a corner and forced to trust in something bigger than ourselves. And at the end of the day, as we lean on God's grace, as we trust in who God is, that we are made whole by his grace, by his mercy, by his love. And in fact, we are better off for that, and we talked about that in the life of Paul. So, we should all be up to speed. Good. This morning, we need to pick up from there and say this. Everything we talked about last week, everything that I am describing, everything with the way that we have, anything in the world with who we are as people, that is not a you problem. I just want to say it again to reiterate. It is not a you problem that you get sick. It is not a you problem that you are going to die. It is not a you problem that the cells in your body can just one day decide we'd like to be different cells and we'd like to be corrupted and messed up and give you cancer. It is not a you problem that you can have a mental illness that follows you the rest of your life or have a chronic illness that never goes away. That is not a you problem. And here's why. You did not ask to be born into this body. The body you have was not your choice, at least as far as we know. Obviously, we the kind of the science fiction-y spirituality. We're not dealing with that. You just showed up here one day. You showed up and you were screaming, and doctor slapped you on the butt and is like, "Oh, it's a girl," and that's just what it is. Like that's you just showed up one day. In fact, not only did you not ask to be born into the body you were born into, you didn't ask to be born at all. Again, as far as you know. This whole experience of life where you are living a temporary existence where you can get sick and die, in no way is that something you chose. Like, I've never met a 2-year-old that was like, oh, yeah, and then one day I'm just, like, hanging out, and then one day Hank comes over, he's like, hey, you want to get born? And I was like, yeah, why not? It's never, it's never happened. Like, we just showed up here. And anyway, even if we did choose to be born, we did not choose to be born into a world with these exact conditions. Like, we didn't ask, we didn't choose to be born into a world, this creation that we live in that has this, chemical makeup and these circumstances and like this world as it is not a thing we chose. It is not, therefore, a you problem, says Judge Marilyn Millian. You did not control it, and much more importantly, it is not your responsibility to fix it. It is not your responsibility to fix this. It is not your responsibility to take responsibility for it. You just showed up here, and you're going to be here for a little bit of time, and you're going to be gone. It is not your responsibility to change anything about the world that we live in. And with that, now we should talk about a guy named Moses. You've probably heard of him. He's a pretty big deal in the Bible. And speaking of people not asking for things, not choosing things, not controlling things, it not being their responsibility, man, Moses was a guy with a lot of baggage in his life that he did not choose. He was a Hebrew. And he didn't choose that. And he was a Hebrew born into Egypt. He didn't choose to be born in Egypt. He was a Hebrew born into Egypt at a time when the Hebrew people were enslaved by the Egyptians. And he didn't choose that. He was a Hebrew who was born into in Egypt, into which he was a slave at a specific period of time when the Pharaoh had said, I want to slaughter the male children so that way they don't grow up and get a sword and rebel against me. So they went about killing babies. Moses didn't choose that. It would have been a really dumb idea if he had. But he didn't. Moses just happens to be born into this world. And all of that is negative stuff, okay? But even the positive stuff, he doesn't choose. Moses doesn't choose to be born into a family that will save him. His family ends up, making this whole plan and arrangement where they end up saving him, and he ends up, being taken by the daughter of the Pharaoh and brought into the royal family and raised as an Egyptian. He didn't choose any of that. Moses is passive in all of this. His whole life is it's just sort of thrust upon him. It's just sort of there. This is just who he is. And so Moses gets to be of an adult, and one day he kills a guy. And okay, fine, he chose that. But well, that's a big deal. That's a flaw in the argument. Let's move on from that. But, he didn't choose all this stuff. I knew that was there. I knew the flaw was there. I wrote that joke. Nobody laughed, so we'll move on from it. Every now and then, the jokes don't land, and we just should move on. But I like to point them out because I don't want you to think that I just thought of the murder thing. No, he chose the murder thing. You shouldn't kill people. Don't do that. So Moses ends up in this world where he really wakes up one day and he realizes I'm nothing, right? Biologically I am a Hebrew, but culturally I'm Egyptian. The way I was born, I should be a slave, but the way I've been raised, I am the most privileged, one of the most privileged people in this entire empire. My actual, real, true people are oppressed and I should help them, but are those my people? In what sense are they my people? I've never known them. And so Moses finds himself sort of between these two cultures, between these two worlds, ends up killing a guy, and he says, okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and leave because now I've committed murder. I'm probably wanted. And so he leaves. He chooses to leave, and he goes away, and he becomes a shepherd around Mount Sinai. And as it turns out, one day, he ends up seeing a very unique situation. He ends up seeing this bush, and the bush is on fire, and the bush is not being consumed. And that's confusing because that's not how either fire or bushes work. And so he's very confused as to what's happening, and he looks at it, and he says, well, that's odd. And so he goes to try to see what happens. And this is what we see happens in the book of Exodus when Moses decides to try to figure out what's going on. We read this. When the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of the bush, Moses, Moses. Here I am, Moses replied. Do not come any closer, the Lord warned. Take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. When Moses heard this, he covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. Now, you guys are probably familiar. If you haven't read in the Bible, you've maybe watched a movie or three about this. And a lot of stuff ends up happening from here. You end up, with the whole Exodus story, and it's a very big deal. It's sort of one of the centers, one of the foundational centers of the biblical narrative. Interestingly enough, though, for all the dramatic stuff that comes later, all the plagues and all the wandering in the wilderness and the crossing the Red Sea and the giving of the Ten Commandments and everything else, everything that flows from this moment, it's actually that moment that Jesus highlights during his ministry. And here's what happened. So the Pharisees, the religious leaders of Israel, always were trying to kind of get Jesus. Kind of just trying to fool him, trying to make him sound stupid, look stupid, say something wrong. And they were just kind of always trying to get him. And the Pharisees did this over and over and over, and they were sort of one political religious party of the Jews, and they were the ones who did it a lot more. But one day, they had tried and it had failed, and so the Sadducees, this other political religious group, decides they're going to make a run at Jesus. Like, they think, okay, we've been watching the Pharisees, we've been watching the people trying to fool Jesus, and I know now how we can get that done. So the Sadducees come to Jesus, and they present to him a unique story that really only makes sense because of who they are as people. The Sadducees, who they were as people, were religious Jews who did not believe in supernatural things. It's just who they were. They didn't believe in miracles. They didn't believe in like angels and stuff. They didn't believe in anything. And specifically, they did not believe in any sort of life after death. For the Jews, life after death, quote unquote, is not like, oh, you die and go to heaven. But for the Jews and also for Jesus, so it's important for us to understand this, is that it's one day there will be a resurrection and things are put back together and restored and we'll live in this resurrected or renovated place. So the Jews, generally, Jews that aren't Sadducees, believe that there's a future resurrection and a future life beyond this one. The Sadducees, rejecting all of the supernatural stuff and all of the miraculous stuff, reject that as well. And that's, okay, well, fine, do what you want, Sadducees. But you know how, you got those friends who are atheists? And, they're on Facebook, and all day, every day, they just share those memes. And they're like, I'll get those Christians. I'll share this picture with 9 words on it, and then they'll know that they're dumb. And then my atheist friends, they'll hit like, and I'll get 11 likes because that's how many atheist friends I have. And it's going to be awesome. I don't know if you guys have thought through what Facebook is and how ridiculous we all are. But we all have those atheist friends who do that. And they're like, oh, get them. Ha-ha, showed them. No one's ever thought of that in 2,000 years. Picture of guy from the Big Bang Theory. Sheldon. I forgot his name for a second. So the Sadducees are sort of like that. They just can't help themselves. It would be one thing if they could keep it to themselves, but they just can't help themselves. They just walk through life just oh, man, we got to get everybody around us. And so they thought if we could make Jesus look stupid for believing in supernatural stuff, which we should stop there. They're coming after Jesus as hey, guy who does miracles and heals people all the time. We don't believe in the supernatural. Let us prove you wrong, guy who's doing it all. It was a terrible plan to start. And their plan revolved around a story. They're like, okay, so we're going to tell this story. So they come to Jesus, and they got this hypothetical story, and they're like, okay, so the law of Moses says that when a guy, a guy marries a woman, and then that guy dies, that his brother is supposed to marry that woman so that way she's taken care of. So what happens if a guy marries a woman, and then he dies, and then his brother marries that woman, but then that guy dies? And then his brother marries the woman, but then that guy dies. And then his brother, and then that guy, 7 times. We've got 7 brothers, and all 7 brothers die, Jesus. In the resurrection that you believe in, whose wife is it? And you think oh, that's a really good question for a 6th grader that couldn't possibly come up with several answers. They just couldn't come up with anything. I mean, that's it. I'm not trying to be hard on atheists. I'm equal. Pause. I'm maybe doubly annoyed with the crazy fundy Christians who are I'm going to share the meme that's going to own the atheists. And my Christian fundy friends, I've got 11 of them, and they're going to hit like. Those guys are doubly annoying because they should know better. Let's stop with the meme stuff. And let's leave each other alone. How about that? All right. Back to the actual sermon. You got bonus sermon. Leave people alone. It's fine. Back to the story. Where was I? So Jesus hears this story. He's like, so the law of Moses, and the whole thing's ridiculous. And I think if you want to know the patience of God, just know that Jesus did not respond with, come on, guys, that's real dumb, stop. Because Jesus could have responded with, come on, guys, that's real dumb, stop. But he didn't. He gave them an answer. And not only did he give them one answer, but he gave them two answers, because Jesus is nothing if not thorough. So they asked this question: Who is the guy? The Sadducees are all like, "Hey, we win! Like we stumped Jesus." And Jesus is like, "Okay, well, this is the first answer to this whole thing about the marriage people. It's in Luke chapter 20. This is what we read. It says, Jesus replied, 'Marriage is for people here on earth, but in the age to come, those worthy of being raised from the dead will neither marry nor be given in marriage, and they will never die again. In this respect, they will be like angels. They are children of God and children of the resurrection.'" Now, I don't know what 3/4 of that passage means, and neither does anybody else. Like, I don't know what it means to be a child of the resurrection. I don't know what it means that, like, we're like angels, because I don't really know what the stories of the angels are. Like, they just show up in, like, the Christmas story and other random places, and sometimes they're terrifying, and sometimes, like, they're the most terrifying things in the Bible, and we're like, let's make them beautiful, because that's what we do. But, like, I don't know what that means. Like, will we have all the eyes and the wing? I don't know. So, nobody knows what that means, but here's what we see happening. First and foremost, as we begin this journey of this conversation, Jesus very much says that there is an age to come, that there is something beyond this world. And it's a something beyond this world that is fundamentally different than what we have in this world. So if we're counting at home, that is sort of step one as we figure out what's going on with God being a healer, is that there's another world to come, and it is fundamentally different than what we see. I don't know exactly what that means, but I do know that, like, there's no marriage, and as an extension of that, there's no, like, childbirth, and we live as children of the resurrection, and we live like angels, and there is no death, and there's all these things. I don't know exactly what it all means, but what we know is Jesus is saying there is something coming later, and it is vastly, fundamentally different than what we have now. And here's how that's possible in the second answer that he gives. This is what he reads. This is what we read next, continuing Luke chapter 20. Jesus says, "But now, as to whether the dead will be raised, even Moses proved this when he wrote about the burning bush." Hey, Jesus quoting that. "Long after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had died, he referred to the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." So he is the God of the living, not the dead, for they are all alive to him. This is a massive piece this is a massive point that we need to understand, that Jesus shows us about God. In the story of the burning bush that we just read, we don't know when that happened. Like, we've got some sort of an idea, but we do know that there are centuries between Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and Moses, like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Jesus says that God is the God of the living, not the dead, which means to God, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who had been dead for centuries, were in fact alive. Now, they were not alive in a sense that, like, we consider alive. Like, it's not like they were actually, like, walking around and, having food and, hanging out with friends and going to it's not that. Like, that's not it at all. But to God, these people were actually alive centuries after they were dead. Which is to say this: Jesus is telling us, and this is the second huge piece of the puzzle when it comes to when we talk about what it means that God is a healer. To God, death is not really death. It's not death the way we understand it. To God, death is not death. Death is something else. And because of that, death is actually not, to God, a remotely scary thing. Let's go back to last week. Last week we talked about this guy named Jairus. Okay, Jesus shows up to Galilee. He's in Galilee, and Jairus is a leader of the synagogue there. And Jairus has got this daughter who's, like, knocking on death's door, like she's about to die. And Jairus comes to Jesus and he's like, "Hey, can you help me? Can you heal me? Can you help my daughter? Can you heal my daughter? Can you help me with this?" And Jesus is like, "Yeah, absolutely. I will absolutely go to your daughter, and I will heal her. And that's when the lady, touches him, and there's the accidental healing. There's all that. So Jesus finally gets to the house where Jairus' daughter is. And this is what we read happened for that miracle. We didn't read it last week, but we're going to read it now. This is what we read in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8. It says, when they arrived at the house, Jesus wouldn't let anyone go in with him except Peter, John, James, and the little girl's father and mother. The house was filled with people weeping and wailing. But he said, stop the weeping. She isn't dead. She's only asleep. But the crowd laughed at him because they all knew that she had died. Then Jesus took her by the hand and said in a loud voice, my child, get up. And in that moment, her life returned, and she immediately stood up. And then Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Now listen, that story is odd. That story is strange. And that story is really awesome. Let's start with the end here. After Jesus brings somebody back from the dead, all Jesus actually says is, she's probably hungry, get her some food. And I've never died myself, but I do understand being hungry. And I bet that if you were, dying and you died, wanting a pizza seems like a thing that you'd want. Like it seems like a thing that you could do. That's how casual Jesus is. Just get her some food. Just the same thing you might say about your child at, breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Just get him some food. Jesus is that casual. Bringing a girl back from the dead is so casual that it is just a morning, afternoon, or night sort of experience. But it's not just a casual thing that's going on here. It's not just a casual thing. It's actually sort of a good thing. Jesus uses the illustration of she is not actually dead, she's just asleep. Now, we need to be some crowd participation here. By show of hands, how many in this room would count sleeping as one of your favorite things? Like everybody. When I was in college, I had a buddy, and we used to plan out naps. Before we went to class, we had this class, and then we had a break. And so before we went to class, we would turn the air conditioner down to 58, and we would black out the windows with towels and aluminum foil. And then we come back, and we have a cave. It was the nap cave. We were adults, guys. That's how much we were napping is the best. It's trying to communicate that to little kids. It's so hard. You have such a gift to you. Jesus says that she's not dead. She's asleep. That thing that everybody wants more of, that's what she is. To Jesus, death is not the big bad wolf. It's a puppy. That's it. It's just a puppy. Death to Jesus is babies sleep in their mother's arms. What a beautiful thing. Adults, on a Saturday afternoon are finally, I've looked forward to this all week. I can sleep from 1 to 3 undisturbed. It's just, he says it's sleep. You see, death is not death to God. It's just not. And all of this is going towards this understanding of this image that Jesus is showing us. You see, Jesus is showing us God when he heals people. And each and every time Jesus heals somebody, what Jesus is showing is that all of this death and all of this sickness and all this stuff that is not a you problem, he has decided is a him problem. Jesus has decided, God has decided, this is my responsibility. I will take care of this. I will take care of this because to me, death isn't that big of a deal. To me, I've got a planned future where it's a whole different world, a whole different understanding, a whole different life, where it's fundamentally different and you guys don't understand, but it's the children of the resurrection and it's all of that, and that's the way it is. Jesus, with each healing, with each moment that he does this, is pointing to the truth that God has made all of this a him problem. And as it turns out, because it is a him problem now, because that is what he has decided, this is not just about people anymore. This is not just about you and me and anybody else. This is not just about sin. This is not just about, sickness. When Jesus says, I'm going to take this, it's going to be a me problem. I take responsibility for this. He takes responsibility for this. This is where we read in the book of Colossians, chapter 1. From the Apostle Paul to this ancient church, he says, Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. Hey, I already quoted that today. He existed before anything was created and is supreme over all creation. For through him, God created everything in the heavenly realms and on earth. He made the things that we can see and the things we can't see, such as thrones, kingdoms, rulers, and authorities in the unseen world. Everything was created through him and for him. He existed before anything else, and he holds all creation together. Christ is also the head of the church, which is his body. He is the beginning, supreme over all who rise from the dead. So he is first in everything. For God in all his fullness was pleased to live in Christ. And through him, God reconciled everything to himself. He made peace with everything in heaven and on earth by means of Christ's blood on the cross. This is not a you problem. You did not ask to be born here. You did not ask to have the struggles you have. Okay. But Christ decided this is a me problem. I will take responsibility for this. And while I'm at it, saving people is a little bit too small for Jesus. I know when I was a kid, it was always like, well, if there was only one person, Jesus would have died for you. And that's a nice thought. Maybe, I don't know, I'm not here, he didn't tell me one way or the other, but we always sort of make it very, very personal. We make it about ourselves. We're very bad as humans about making everything about ourselves. We're very bad as Christians about making everything Jesus did about us. But each and every time that Christ healed, he pointed to something bigger about God. That God has decided that the responsibility of the entirety of all the brokenness of all of his creation, and the things we can see and the things we can't see. And by the way, I have no idea what those are, but it's something. Everything in heaven and on earth. I don't know what needs fixed in heaven. I don't actually know what that means at all. I don't need to. Everything, all of it. Jesus has said, this is a me problem. I will fix it. I hold all creation together, and I will reconcile all things back to me. I will make peace with all things. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. And all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty back together again, but Jesus can. So Jesus does. That is what the healing miracles are pointing us to. Ultimately, we need to understand that God heals. God is a healer. But the fact of the matter is this. It's not just about us. And it's not just about part of creation. And it's not just about the stuff we can see and understand. And it's all the things. Jesus has taken responsibility for all of it. He said, I will fix it. I will take responsibility. In an act of mercy and love and compassion, in an act of grace for a creation that, by the way, he did not break, he says, fine, someone else, something else broke it. I don't care. I'll fix it. And so Jesus walks around and he heals people. And it's that truth he's pointing to. And when you and I look at the healing miracles in the Bible, it's that truth that we should be reminded of. This life is not the only life. The things that we are scared of, the things that keep us up at night, the things that cause us to grieve, are not things that Jesus is overly concerned about. I mean, there's all these dead guys, and he's just like, yeah, they're still alive. I don't know exactly how, but to God it is. And here's a little girl who's dead. He's like, she's just sleeping. The things that we grieve, that we stay awake at night fighting, praying against, are things that Christ has under control. He is holding creation together. And as we look at the brokenness of life in every single way, the hope of our faith is that that brokenness for all creation, for everyone, for all things, for all of life, for all the stuff, for in every way that we can possibly imagine and can't imagine, that Christ has promised, it's my responsibility, I've got it. Man, that's really good news. Because at the end of the day, it's not a you problem. I can't fix this stuff. I can barely fix the way my morning's going, you know? But when we look at life, that's what it means that Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. We got one more week. We got one more picture we need to see. One more divine portrait in which Jesus is like Bob Ross, except instead of painting happy little trees, he is painting for us the exact nature of God. Before we get to next week, we've got this one lesson this morning. Our second lesson of this sermon, our fifth lesson of this series, is this. God is a healer, and so he is healing all of his creation, fixing all that has been broken with the worlds he has made. God is a healer, and so he is healing all of his creation, fixing all that has been broken with the worlds that he has made. The Bible teaches that when we understand who God is and we want to take God up on this offer, that we are to repent to be baptized. It sounds like two things. It's really just one. In repentance, we change who we are. We change our minds. We say, I want to do things God's way. Heart, soul, and mind, body, life, we want to change. We want to orient ourselves to God. That's repentance. And in baptism, we've got that picture of us dying, being raised from the dead, and aligning ourselves with Christ's death and resurrection. You never made the decision. We got a nice warm baptistry. All sorts of folks can do it. Let's talk. If you're an immersed believer in Christ, and you're looking for a perfect church home, this is not it. I totally forgot the musicians to come to the stage. And so there it is. There it is. Also, that one joke earlier was terrible. You didn't like it. So we're not a perfect church. Also, I messed up like 3 songs this morning. Like, that's not how Indescribable is supposed to go. I don't know if you guys are aware that, like, it's not just supposed to keep going. And then, like, we'll just keep doing that chorus over and over. Like, not that. The poor musicians are just like, we're just going to keep following Drew over and over. Just keep singing these songs. I was thinking about, like, 9 other things while I was going on. Anyway, I now don't know where I'm at. Look, it's the end of the sermon, and you understand how that goes. So let's stand and sing.